And we're back, so we'll continue our discussion of ethics. So we talked about some of the different principles of ethics, but what happens when you have an ethical transgression? What happens when legitimate and lawful behavior is breached? Well, typically the law will step in. Society can also condemn unethical managers, but we'll talk about that a little later in the lecture. So right now we're just going to talk about the legal aspects of it. So managers, of course, can be prosecuted for criminal actions. Hopefully that's not a surprise to anyone. Corporations are defined as separate legal kind of people, and corporations can also be criminally liable for actions that are illegal, illegitimate, and corrupt. Criminal prosecution of corporations, though, because even though legally they are people, physically they are not. So prosecution can be very, very difficult. Now there's a variety of different kinds of crimes. Of course, you have what is known as a white-collar crime. That's the kind of crime that usually involves cheating, corruption, deception. Usually doesn't result in a loss of life, limb, or eyesight. And it typically has something to do with unethical actions that were used to further personal gain during the course of employment. Then you have a deferred prosecution agreement. And that basically means a prosecutor and a corporation have agreed that prosecution will be delayed and allow the corporation to actually take remedial action. Then you also have a non-prosecution agreement where prosecutors decline to go after a corporation if they've taken appropriate steps to report a crime, cooperate, and compensate victims. And of course, a monitor is someone that can be hired by a corporation to oversee these kind of fulfillment of these conditions in agreement to avoid a criminal indictment. Now, why in the world would a corporation agree to take remedial action if they're going to be prosecuted anyhow? And why would actually prosecutors even allow corporations who did wrong in the first place to actually try to make it up after they've been caught? Well, the more of that stuff they can make up outside the courts, of course, that saves the government money, time, and resources, and hopefully can result in a more equitable solution. Now, and this is where it gets tricky, because a corporation is a legal person but not a physical person, managers can go to prison, they can be fined, they can be put on probation, community service, they can make restitution, and they can be banned from working in their occupations. But corporations can't be imprisoned. They can be fined, their actions can be restricted, and in the worst case scenario, they can be broken up or dismantled by the government. Now, you got some different forces shaping corporate ethics. You've got a leader's example. Okay. You've got strategies and policies. You've got organization culture. And you've got individual characteristics. So each of these four kind of internal forces can result in an ethical performance that we would say is elevated, average, or compromise. Basically, compromise being it stinks. Leadership is by far the most important and the strongest influence on integrity. And as a manager, you're going to notice that if you make any sort of ethical compromise or any sort of indiscretion, even no matter how small it is, your subordinates will see that, and then they'll do 10 times worse and say because you did just a little something wrong, that made it okay for them to do something very wrong. Okay? So as a manager, you have to remember that your actions are under a magnifying glass at all times. So you must always behave ethically, you must always behave appropriately, and just don't even give in to just even a little bit, because people will see, and then they'll blow it way out of proportion. Okay? So yeah, leadership is very important. You must live your company values through and through. Strategies and policies are also a big influence on ethical performance. Of course, you want to have a competitive strategy. You want to be a strong corporation. However, if you set unrealistic goals, then under pressure, your subordinates will cheat and take shortcuts in order to meet the unrealistic goals that you as a manager set. So that's actually very dangerous and something you might want to avoid. And of course, as we'll talk more on corporate governance at our very last lecture, reward and compensation systems can also make employees behave unethically. Now, corporate culture is an interesting one, and that can also serve as a reflection of underlying values. So, corporate culture, it's those values, norms, the rituals. It's basically everything that I've highlighted over here. Now, there's three kind of levels of corporate culture. You've got artifacts, espoused values, and tacit underlying values. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, let's talk about tacit underlying values. Have you ever been in a firm and you want to do something really desperate? People say, well, we just don't do it that way here. No, it just doesn't seem right. They can tell you not to do whatever it is you wanted to do, but they can't exactly tell you why you shouldn't do that. They can't articulate exactly why, but it's tacit, it's implied, it's implicit. Okay? These are your tacit underlying values. You know that you shouldn't do something, but you can't quite explain why. Espoused values. Some of you that were working in the 90s will probably remember these. Remember those motivational posters that you'd see, it'd say, courage, and it would have, a picture of somebody walking around a track or something. Okay, those are espoused values. Those are things that are explicit. Okay, explicit being the opposite of tacit. Those are explicit. Wow, I need to behave with courage. I need to behave in a way that is good, ethical, integrity, whatever. Those are things that you can say, well, that doesn't adhere to integrity. Our company's definition of integrity. Don't do that. That's not integrity to the community. That's dishonest behavior. You can say it very clearly. And those are things that the company openly espouses, frequently in mission statements. Now, artifacts are very complicated in how they impact corporate culture. We talk about typically what you might see as an artifact of corporate culture would be the way your office is set up. Okay? Do you have an open office space, or do you have people in cubicles or people in offices with their doors behind them? Corporate culture can also have, as what Hofstede would say, kind of a low and high power distance, and that can be reflected in artifacts too. Let me give an example. A high power distance culture means that managers are generally going to be isolated from their employees. You think about when you have a boss and you see that something is wrong, and you don't feel comfortable going to your boss or even talking to your boss or possibly even saying hello to your boss because that boss is so far away from you and very aloof. That's high power distance. Now, low power distance is the opposite. Of course, you can talk to your boss, you can have a cup of coffee with them, and you can laugh and joke, and you feel comfortable coming to your boss with your problems. That's a low power distance. Okay? I'll give two examples from personal experience of high power distance and low power distance that'll hopefully help. A friend of mine had worked in Japan for a number of years, and that is seen to be a high power distance culture in some circumstances. And evidently, whenever the CEO of this company would get on the elevator, everybody else would get out to give that CEO adequate room on the elevator. So that's high power distance. They respected that person or almost feared them so much that they had to leave the elevator just because he was getting on. Now, I went to graduate school in France. Again, that's in an institution that was definitely high power distance. And I think in terms of artifacts, this was particularly germane. We had multiple dining facilities depending on your status. Okay, so if you were a student, they had the regular student cafeteria, and the food was, pretty bad. It was the worst food I've probably ever had. Even worse than the Army, and worse than what we served inmates when I was deployed. So really, really bad food, but that's what we serve students. Well, not me personally, but that's what the school serves students. Now, if you were a Ph.D. student like me, or you were a member of the staff, there was another cafeteria, and I'd say the food was 50-50. Sometimes it was edible, and sometimes it wasn't. It was better than the student cafeteria, but it still wasn't very good. At least you had a place to sit, though. It was a separate cafeteria. Now, if you were an administrator or a department head or something like that, then you could actually go to this separate room at the school, and you could actually order off the menu, and you could have a 4-course, professionally prepared meal with wine and all sorts of wonderful things. So that was another tier of service. I got to eat there twice. Once when I defended the proposal for my Ph.D. and then once after I defended my Ph.D. And the food was truly amazing. It was really, really good food. And I was surprised that the chefs who prepared such bad food for students and staff could prepare such good food when you were somebody. Now, if you were really important, you got to eat with the president of the school. And he lived in a castle behind the school, and he had a majordome, which is kind of like a butler who cooks. And that guy would, personally cook meals for the president of the school and whoever was joining him for lunch or dinner. And evidently, these were almost Michelin-starred meals. So you can see how cafeterias can actually reinforce a corporate culture that emphasizes a high power distance. Okay, a low power distance. Sometimes I saw it in the Army, actually, with low power distance. You'd be amazed what a good general would do when they took command. They'd take out the lowest enlisted soldier and they'd ask him to come out for coffee. And they would talk to them. Hey, well, what do you think? What do you like? And of course, that lower enlisted soldier would just spill their guts, tell them everything going on. The general would never yell or anything, but then when he'd go back to his office, he'd let that person's managers know what he thought was right or wrong going on. So that's an example of low power distance. Of course, again, to use an example from Japan, evidently under the principles of Kaizen, any factory worker can make a suggestion on how to improve operations. That's an example of low power distance. Employees feel empowered to talk to their supervisors. Okay, so moving on. Now we're on to individual characteristics. So personality traits are important, and they're a less studied aspect of organizational ethics, namely because it's a little bit hard to come up with the research on it. It seems that Machiavellianism, or the ends justify the means, seems to be part of individual characteristics. I would ask you to think about the fact that individuals have different faces. They have a personal face, a business face, a family face, etc. And I think these characteristics, as they're blended together, can contribute to their overall ethical picture. Yeah, so how do corporations manage ethics? So the first thing is you have to establish standards and procedures. Tell your employees explicitly what is and is not permissible. That's at least a start. It's not perfect. Okay? Create high-level oversight. Basically what you got to do as a manager, you have to get out of your office and see what your people are doing. Okay? Ask them what are they doing. Do you see anything right or wrong? Encourage that low power distance. Of course, the idea, some people say that you have to screen out criminals. I'm not sure about that. People who have been confined at one time or another may deserve a second chance. So I struggle with this screening out criminals. And if they're good criminals, you probably won't detect them anyhow. Communicating standards to all employees. As a manager, have meetings, have team building meetings with your employees, with your subordinates. Take them out to lunch. Put out information to them. Hey, we're doing this new operation. These are my expectations. Have that kind of two-way, low-power distance communication. That's very helpful. Of course, hotlines are important. Sometimes certain managers will create such a hostile work environment that employees don't feel comfortable speaking out. So you have a hotline, and the hotline will basically serve as a way to leave an anonymous complaint or anonymous tip about ethical transgressions going on. If you're in charge of the hotline, take all of these complaints seriously. While sometimes people are messing around with their disgruntled employees, the few times that those complaints are legitimate or serious, you need to make sure that you take action. Of course, you have to set up standards, and you have to discipline violators. You have to set the same standards of punishment every single time. You can't let somebody off this one time and then not another time, etc. So you have to have the same degrees of punishment every time, no matter how much you like or dislike an employee. And of course, if there's any oversight, like right in here, you need to assess that. You need to modify your program. Now, there's a couple other things I want to point out to you. How do you manage ethics? So you can have an ethics and compliance program, which is basically your structures, your policies, all that written stuff, all that formal bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo that says what is and is not appropriate. Now, you can also have kind of a high and low power distance approach too. Now, you can have what we might call the compliance approach, which would typically emphasize a higher power distance, and basically an ethics program emphasizes following rules, laws, regulations, and policy. So if an employee is not sure what to do, they just look it up in the regulation. They don't ask the boss. Okay? They just look it up. It says exactly do this, I do that, I'm good to go. However, if you are faced with a unique or unknown situation, you might have a problem. Now, the ethics approach is a low power distance, and that basically means that you teach people to think critically about ethical issues and encourage them to interpret these things for themselves. Now, the bad thing is, if you don't have things as explicit in the compliance program, employees may not be entirely sure what to do in every situation, but when there's unknowns, they'll know how to think through a situation critically. So that wraps up our first discussion of ethics. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll go into a lot more depth on this during class. I'm Duncan Pelly, and I will see you next time.